All right, for today's explainer, we are diving into a really complex and honestly fascinating theological argument from our source material. It takes a look at one of the most foundational beliefs in Islam and suggests there might be a kind of hidden paradox right at the heart of the concept of God's oneness.
So this one sentence, this is really the core idea we're unpacking today. The argument we're about to walk through makes a pretty bold claim that even as Islamic theology explicitly rejects the Christian idea of the Trinity, one God in three persons, it might unintentionally build a very similar structure. So let's dig into the logic behind that.
Okay, so to even begin to wrap our heads around this argument, we have to start with the absolute foundation of Islam, and that is the total, indivisible oneness of God. This isn't just a belief, it's the bedrock of the entire faith. Now, this core doctrine has a name, Tawhid, and our source material points to something really interesting about the word itself. Its root verb, wahada, literally means to unite or to make one. And this raises a question that's central to the whole analysis. If the concept is about uniting something, well, what exactly is being united? And you can see this principle stated so clearly in the Quran. This verse is probably the most famous declaration of God's absolute singularity. It is a non-negotiable point of faith, and it's the very foundation that this entire argument we're examining is built on.
Right, so we have that foundation firmly in place. Now, let's get to the core of the source's argument. It suggests that inside Islamic scripture itself, there are certain ideas that, they create a kind of theological challenge to a view of God that is strictly and singularly one. And here it is, the main thesis of the analysis. It puts forward this idea that Islamic theology actually affirms three distinct realities that are all described as in some way divine. So let's break down what these three realities are, according to the source.
So, what are these three realities that the source identifies? This is where the argument gets really intricate and starts drawing some direct comparisons. Okay, take a look at this. This table basically lays out the entire argument in a nutshell. It takes three key concepts from Islamic theology: Allah, Kalimatullah, or the word of Allah, and Ruh Allah, the spirit of Allah. And it draws a direct parallel to the Father, Word, and Spirit in the Christian Trinity. Now, it is absolutely crucial to state here that mainstream Islamic theology has very clear explanations for these concepts that strongly uphold God's oneness. We're just exploring the specific logic of this particular argument from our source. First up, the argument zooms in on the word, or kalimatullah. Now, a core belief in Islam is that the Quran itself is the uncreated, eternal word of Allah. The analysis really grabs onto this idea of an eternal word, something that comes from God but has always existed, and it argues this presents a second eternal reality right alongside God himself. Next, the analysis looks at the spirit of Allah, or Ruh Allah. It points to verses where the spirit is doing things that you think only God could do, like creating and giving life. And because the spirit is described as being sent from Allah and acting as its own agent, the source argues this establishes a third, co-eternal, divine reality. So you have the word, you have the spirit, and now let's see how these ideas build into what the source calls the central paradox. And this all revolves around the nature of the Quran as God's eternal speech. So, like we've said, the orthodox belief is that the Quran isn't a creation, it's the eternal speech of God. That means it has existed forever, right alongside God. This is a super important premise for the next step in the source's chain of logic. Okay, now think about Surah Al-Fatiha, the very first chapter of the Quran. It's a prayer, right? It's someone speaking directly to God. And if the entire Quran is eternal, well, that means this prayer has also existed for all of eternity. And this brings us to the big central question that the analysis poses. If an eternal prayer exists, a prayer that is addressed to God, then who was saying the prayer for all of eternity before a single person or thing was ever created? The source says this leads to a logical dilemma with two possible answers. Possibility A, Allah is just praying to himself for all of eternity. Or possibility B, the Quran, this eternal word, is actually a distinct personal being that's addressing Allah. The analysis argues that either one of those possibilities makes that simple Unitarian view of God a lot more complicated. And the analysis doesn't stop there. It brings up a few other theological puzzles to support its case. For example, it points to a verse that says Allah preys upon the prophet, which raises all sorts of questions. It also mentions traditions where the Quran itself is described like a person, pleading for believers on Judgment Day. And finally, it brings up the concept of an eternal tablet in heaven, which would seem to imply yet another uncreated reality existing alongside God.
So how does this source bring all these different threads together? Well, it synthesizes all these points into one final concluding thought.
So to just quickly recap the argument we've been walking through, the claim is that within Islamic theology itself, you find an eternal word that seems to be personal, a God who is described as praying, speech that addresses God from eternity, and a book that is said to act and intercede all on its own. But in the end, the source doesn't actually try to give a definitive answer. Instead, its analysis leaves us with this much bigger, more philosophical question. Is God just more complex than our theological language can even begin to describe? It's a thought-provoking idea, really, that maybe the divine is just more mysterious than any single framework we create can ever fully capture. And that's a thought to ponder long after this explainer is over.